Good day, citizens, and welcome to this week's podcast edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, it's Volume 6 of the Jefferson Hour Book Club.
It is. We've been looking at books that matter either to Jefferson or to us about Jefferson. And this is Ron Chernow's magisterial Alexander Hamilton. Chernow is an amazing man himself. He's written a bunch of books. Washington, A Life won the Pulitzer Prize. I haven't read it. House of Morgan, 1990. He wrote a biography of John D. Rockefeller in 1998, and his most recent book is a biography of Ulysses S. Grant. He's become like Joseph Ellis and David McCullough, and Doris Kearns Goodwin, one of the supreme public intellectuals of our time.
We both really enjoyed this book. I think both of us had read it before, but reread it for discussion this week. And it's not just a great historical biography, but it gives a lot of insight, not only to Hamilton, but to those around him, Madison, Jefferson, Washington, others.
I think Jefferson comes off as a Machiavellian figure in this book, as not altogether reliable and not always truthful in his epic fight against Hamilton and Hamiltonianism. So that troubles me a little. I think that's something of a distortion. But leaving that aside, if you want to understand Alexander Hamilton, you want to read this book. It's worth all 800 pages. It's very, very well written. I suppose I read most of it in a 2.5-day period. But you have to work at it. I mean, it's not a pamphlet by any means.
Yeah, but I found it more enjoyable the second time around. I really did. We got one question that we didn't include in the show.
Okay.
And there's a couple things we need to do after that as well. Just clarify some dates for the cultural tours. But this comes from Steve Bullington from Zionsville, Indiana.
Zionsville.
And he writes that he's over the last 4 years become a huge fan of Hamilton, the musical.
Of course.
And all of this leads to my question. I believe that we are an amalgamation of our life experiences, and that's what makes us who we are. After reading Chernow's accounts of the struggles of the Continental Army at the hands of an American government that never fully supported the war with funds, materials, or men, do you think Jefferson might have had a more Hamiltonian approach to centralized government had he suffered alongside Washington, Hamilton, and their men at Valley Forge?
Yes. I mean, certainly some things would have changed. So, that's a great letter. This goes to the old saying, where you stand depends on where you sit. So Jefferson wasn't at Valley Forge. He wasn't trying to hold the ragtag army together. He didn't see how disastrous a militia system was. He didn't see how Washington was filled with deep despair at times about how we're going to hold this thing together long enough to survive this war. And so Jefferson doesn't understand that, and he has this sort of philosophical idea of a militia system because it squares with his reading of Roman Republican history, and it squares with his reading of Virgil and so on. And this is the rap on Jefferson, that his visions are great, but they're not grounded,
and they're dated,
and they're mythological. They're not real. Yeah. And so Adams is always saying, "Well, I love you, Jefferson, but you're so unrealistic." And Madison's saying, "You're the greatest man who ever lived, but we're going to have to figure out how to make this work." And Hamilton's like, who is this guy? Who is this guy that doesn't even live in the real world? It's just like it's all poetry and philosophy and
that's a lot of where our discussion about the book went. Is that Hamilton grew up under stressful circumstances, we'll say, and as you put it, Jefferson was born with a silver spoon in his mouth.
Yeah, there's that. Jefferson's life was infinitely easier in that respect. On the other hand, Hamilton's children tended to live. 4 of Jefferson's 6 children died in infancy. Nobody has a monopoly on grief and setbacks in life. But I think that Jefferson couldn't understand. So the letter is a great one because it says if Jefferson had their experiences, he might have had a different attitude towards military, and he might have had a different attitude towards centralized government, clearly. But you can say the reverse. If Hamilton had been in Philadelphia and had not been a warrior and had been a writer of the Revolution. Instead, he might have had quite a different view from the one that he eventually took. So, we're products of our circumstances.
The answer to his question is self-evident, yes.
And John Locke was right. We're born with a tabula rasa, and what gets inscribed on that blank slate tells us who we are.
Well, let's go to the show. But before we do, there was a little bit of confusion about some
My
dates
fault.
to your. Oh, really?
It was. So I said, so the Jefferson and France trip has a few more places, and I'm just so excited about it. We're getting very close now to finalizing all the details. It's going to be a magnificent trip.
But
So
the actual, this is written in stone dates.
17th through 26 October. October 17th through 26, 2019, Paris, Aix-en-Provence, Marseille, Bordeaux, etc.
And as always, go to jeffersonhour.com and you can find out all the details.
And if you're wavering at all, just know this much: it might be 3 years before we get back. So Jefferson in France, October 17th through 26, 2019. Then the winter retreat on the space program. This is the year. I mean, we're only by the time people hear this, Neil Armstrong will be setting foot on the moon 50 years ago.
Oh, I remember that well.
January 12th through 17th, west of Missoula at the famous Lochsa Lodge, the winter retreat exploring the space program with an emphasis on the Apollo moon landings, and some films like Gravity and Apollo 13 and First Man and so on. The second winter retreat is on Charles Dickens. I did not choose that. That was by the demand of the group, but I love it. 4 novels by Dickens, The Imagination of Charles Dickens. That's January 18th through 23rd. And then finally, Cuba. We're going on Roosevelt's Cuba up San Juan Hill, which we will charge, and also Hemingway. So Hemingway and Theodore Roosevelt's Cuba, February 8th through 17th, 2020. So to review, Jefferson in France, October 17th through 26th. That's the one that I got wrong. The winter retreat on the space program, January 12th through 17th. I can't wait for that one. The winter retreat on Dickens, even more, January 18th through 23rd. And then I've never been to Cuba, but our friend Wayne Fairchild of the Lewis and Clark Outfitters has been, and he says, you can't believe how great it is to be in Hemingway's Cuba. And then I'm going to bring the Theodore Roosevelt Spanish-American War to bear on that too. So all those wonderful cultural tours are coming. And then next summer, the classical Lewis and Clark in Montana and Idaho trip again.
With that, I will say just very quickly that we so appreciate those of you who listen to this show. We also very much appreciate all of the mail that we get. And if you are of a mind to, you can go to jeffersonhour.com and support the show. We always appreciate that. We need that. And if you go to the website and click on donate, there's all sorts of options. You can join the 1776 Club and get access to all sorts of more fun things.
And I don't think it would be fair if I didn't, before we say farewell, say, please send me gifts. Because it would be the first time I didn't say it, and people would be missing it.
Yeah, okay then. Let's go to the show. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome, everyone. This is Clay Jenkinson, out of character this week, because this is the 6th installment of the Thomas Jefferson Hour Book Club. And in some moment of terrible weakness, David, we agreed to read Ron Chernow's Alexander Hamilton.
Well, I think it's reread for both of us, isn't it?
Well, I had read in it. I'm not sure that I had ever read it, but I gave the last couple of days to working my way through it. And let me say this right off the top. It is a spectacular biography.
It really is.
It is eminently readable. It's not tedious the way some biographies of founding fathers are. Chernow's work is just really magnificent, you have to say. And the portrait that he creates of Alexander Hamilton is certainly definitive for our time. You know, he's obviously pro-Hamilton, as one must be, I think, to write such a book.
Well, I didn't think that as much on my second read as I did on my first. I must say, and no pun intended, I really appreciated the way he bookended this. He began with a prologue titled "The Oldest Revolutionary War Widow," which is Elizabeth Hamilton, and he ended it with her death. I thought that was it was a real nice touch. I like that.
She lived a long time after the premature death of her extraordinary husband in July of 1804. Her life was quite difficult, as a matter of fact, because he had left them in some ways penniless. And as you know, just a couple of years before Hamilton's death on the dueling grounds at Weehawken, New Jersey, their son Philip had been cut down in a duel defending his father's honor.
Which is a whole nother discussion. But there is a page that you wanted to get to right away.
Thank you, David. I just love this passage. It's from page 481. And this is when Hamilton finally leaves the Washington administration in 1795. Jefferson left in December of 1793. Hamilton won the great battle for the attention of President Washington. He stayed on until 1795. He didn't stay on until the end of Washington's second term. He was needing the money. He had a large and growing family. I think the pay for the Secretary of Treasury was $3,500 per year. He couldn't make that work, and so he went back to New York, his adopted state, and he went into the law and actually became one of the greatest lawyers of his time. But Chernow backs up at this point on page 481 to assess the public career of Hamilton. I just want to read this. I think it's so well written, and I think it's so right. Whatever his disappointments, Hamilton, 40, must have left Philadelphia with an immense feeling of accomplishment. The Whiskey Rebellion had been suppressed, the country's finances flourished, and the investigation into his affairs had ended with a ringing exoneration. He had prevailed in almost every major program he had sponsored, whether the bank, assumption, funding the public debt, the tax system, the customs service, or the Coast Guard, despite years of complaints and bitter smears. John Quincy Adams later stated that his financial system, quote, operated like enchantment for the restoration of public credit. Bankrupt when Hamilton took office, the United States now enjoyed a credit rating equal to that of any European nation. He had laid the groundwork for both liberal democracy and capitalism and helped to transform the role of the president from passive administrator to active policymaker, creating the institutional scaffolding for America's future emergence as a great power. He had demonstrated the creative uses of government and helped to weld the states irreversibly into one nation. He had also defended Washington's administration more brilliantly than anyone else, articulating its constitutional underpinnings and enunciating key tenets of foreign policy. "We look in vain," said Henry Cabot Lodge, "for a man who, in an equal space of time, has produced such direct and lasting effects upon our institutions and history." Hamilton's achievements were never matched because he was present at the government's inception when he could draw freely on a blank slate. And now this: if Washington was the father of the country and Madison the father of the Constitution, then Alexander Hamilton was surely the father of the American government.
Boy, that's great. And
Is that something?
That's a perfect pick. If you were only reading one thing from this book, that could be it.
So that's an amazing summation of Hamilton's public career, and it ends with Hamilton was the father of the American government. He's the father of our fiscal system. This leaves out things. He helped to win ratification for the Constitution, including in a very key way in his own state of New York, where the ratification was doubtful. He was one of the two principal authors of the Federalist Papers. In fact, he wrote more of the Federalist Papers than did James Madison. Hamilton played a very large role in Washington's farewell address, and this summation on page 481 doesn't talk about his record in the war, where he not only was George Washington's principal aide-de-camp and private secretary, but at the Battle of Yorktown,
which he so desperately wanted.
He finally got battle, and he distinguished himself heroically at Yorktown. So, we're talking about a monumental human being here. And I know on the Jefferson Hour, I spent a lot of time running down Colonel Hamilton, and I think for good reason. But this is a balanced assessment, and you can't read passages like the one that I just recited here without thinking, we're lucky to have had Alexander Hamilton at the center or near the center.
That's almost blasphemy, isn't it? We should start a little bit at the beginning. his background, which he sort of hid during his life. In conversation, it's only really come to light in the past century, where he came from, how he grew up, how he got to New York.
Born in the Caribbean, on the island of Nevis, raised partly in St. Croix. His father was Scottish, kind of fallen into abuse and decrepitude, kind of a faded member of minor Scottish nobility, profligate, bankrupt, alcohol, trouble. And his mother, Rachel, whom he, of course, had a very special spot for, was thought to be a whore. She was divorced by her husband as a loose woman. She connected herself with men who could help her survive. So she was widely thought to be a fallen woman in the way that that era could look upon a woman as fallen. And she had to really scramble in life. And so Hamilton, of course, was embarrassed by this, that his father was a wreck and his mother was seen as a strumpet. He grew up sort of in that world, incredibly volatile, with no economic certainty, no parental certainty, had to grow up very fast and very young. And he was sort of farmed out to a merchant, an import-export man in the Caribbean, and there he began to show his administrative genius.
He writes, Chernow writes in the book, like Ben Franklin, Hamilton was mostly self-taught and probably snatched every spare moment to read. The young clerk aimed to be a man of letters. He may already have had a premonition that his facility with words would someday free him from his humble birth and place him on a par with the most powerful men of his age.
He got the attention of some wealthy merchants in the Caribbean because of his capacity in this import-export business.
He wrote poems.
He wrote poems, including one about a hurricane.
Right.
And that hurricane piece was thought to be so good, had so much potential.
Maybe we can post that poem on the website.
I thought you were going to recite it.
Oh, certainly not.
But then on the basis of that, these merchants decided that they're going to send him to the mainland. They're going to send him to the mainland to get some higher education, and maybe he'll come back and maybe he won't. So,
Chernow talks about how they had hoped that he might come back as a physician, which they desperately needed.
Because they realized what they had here, which was a natural genius. Jefferson would call him a natural aristocrat. We would say rags to riches, self-made, Horatio Alger, whatever we say. They sent him to the New World, to the mainland, because they couldn't. There's nothing for him there in terms of further education. And he first went to Princeton, the College of New Jersey, but he was so insistent that he knew better than James Witherspoon how he should study, that Witherspoon, the president of Princeton, declined to keep him. So then Hamilton went to King's College in New York, which is now Columbia, and there he rocketed his way through the curriculum and was great at everything he did. And then to get kind of set up where this all heads, just at that time, as he's studying at Columbia in New York, where there's a beautiful statue to him in a Hamilton Hall, he sees the revolution coming. And at that time, he was an ardent lover of the independence movement. He later became kind of a Tory and a conservative, but at this time he was a young rabble-rouser calling for independence.
Writing about it too. Before we go too much further, there's one other piece that Chernow writes in the book. He says, Alexander Hamilton never needed to worry about leading a tedious, uneventful life. Drama shadows his footsteps. And it really does throughout the book. I mean, there's these incredible experiences that he has. And he talks about when he first sailed to America, the ship he was on caught fire. And they had to lower buckets into the sea to put the fire out. So he arrived in Boston in this burnt out ship. And it's one thing after another.
When you hear this story, you can see why the blockbuster musical Hamilton appeals. Because Jefferson was born, as we like to say, with a silver spoon in his mouth. Hamilton kind of claws his way out of the Caribbean into greatness by his own capacities. And it is kind of the quintessential American story of somebody who is born without advantages in life, and through some lucky breaks and sheer hard work plus genius, becomes the second most important person in the United States, at least during the 2 terms of President Washington's presidential administration. That's a fundamentally appealing American story, and Hamilton embodies it in a way that Thomas Jefferson never could.
It is. Chernow also writes that he had always displayed an unusual capacity for impressing older, influential men.
You could say, if you were a Freudian, that Hamilton's constantly looking for a father figure because his own father was such a disappointment and a disaster. And my goodness, did he find one in George Washington.
We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment to continue this discussion about Ron Chernow's fabulous biography, Hamilton. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week we are doing number 6, I believe you said.
Yes, the book club, by popular demand. We took on this immense book. It is a great book, and I loved reading it, but it's 800 pages.
Yeah, it's about a 10, 12-hour read, wouldn't you guess?
Oh, easily. For you, maybe. For me, it's like 40 hours.
You've obviously read it more than once.
I read it, and I have to say, and maybe this is how some of our listeners feel too, I read it reluctantly. I thought, okay, do I really want 800 pages on Hamilton? Because, as you know, I do actually resent the apotheosis of Hamilton in our time. I think it's a mistake. I think that I get the rags to riches story.
It's just showbiz.
It's not just showbiz. It's part of a kind of a revisionist view that Jefferson's down and others are up, and we're kind of shrugging our shoulders and saying, yeah, we get it. We're a military, industrial, economic empire, and everyone's in the stock market, and we all have our 401ks, and our currency works because of the fiscal arrangements that Hamilton made, and so on. But I think it's a mistake for us to give Hamilton a pass. But leaving that aside, once I got over that and said, okay, well, I'm going to read this book because, it's.
You said you would.
I said I would,
Yeah.
and it's going to help me. And I'm if you look at my copy here, I've marked up passages in every single direction, and I learned a great deal from it, and I'm fascinated by it. And I think that his handling of some of the key episodes in Hamilton's life is just first rate.
One of the things that I really admire about the book and his writing is that, yes, it is a historical account. It's factual. Everything is backed up with footnotes or examples or sources. But also stuck within the book are these nuggets that give us a real insight into Hamilton's character. You talked about how he was sort of a radical at college. And there's this account of Miles Cooper. Do you recall that?
Yes, go ahead.
And he was, during a demonstration, Miles Cooper was pro-British, and the crowd was after him and certainly would have done him bodily harm. But Hamilton stepped in, and there's differing accounts, but essentially what he did is he held the crowd off long enough for Miles Cooper to escape, in spite of the fact that he didn't sympathize with him. He knew that was the right thing to do, and that was sort of a trend of his. He was always wanting to do the honorable thing.
Honor is the key word. So honor with a capital H, honor in all caps. And the first letter that we have of his is to his friend Ned, and he says, I wish there were a war. I wish there were some way, because he doesn't want to remain what he calls his groveling condition. And he says, I will do anything to set myself up as an important figure in the world except violate a principle of honor. And so this is the key word in Hamilton. And as you know, it ends on the dueling grounds at Weehawken, New Jersey, because of that. As we were sort of getting ready to do this program, as we drove up to the barn, you said something that intrigued me. You said, as a kind of a quiz, who did the most damage to Alexander Hamilton? And I thought, is it Jefferson? Is it Burr? And then you answered.
himself.
Why did you say that?
Well, because the duel is, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but he was just intractable. And as you said, when it came to honor, capital H, all caps, right? And that, I understand that. And when you read the biography, you understand it even more because of where he came from and what he was trying to accomplish. If you are as rigid as Hamilton was, you miss part of the big picture. That's my take.
Well, I can say this, not to, again, get ahead of ourselves, but Jefferson had several chances to be in duels. They're called affairs of honor. They're still very common, particularly in the South. So if you wanted to get into a duel, you could easily get yourself into a duel in Jefferson's era. And on a couple of occasions, he sort of was in a situation where it was heading towards that, an affair of honor. And Jefferson believed that dueling is barbaric and puerile, and that there's nothing in the world worth shooting another man from 20 paces. So when he had these opportunities, he stepped back because he realized it's just not worth it. And what does it do to your family? And really, he had a kind of a sticks and stones may break my bones kind of an attitude. There's not anything really worth fighting a duel over. Jefferson is a highly civilized man, and he has enormous good sense. When you see Hamilton's capacity to be tripped up, it's almost Pavlovian that you can get to Hamilton, you can get him off of his center of gravity, you can make his enormous sense of honor flare up. Once you realize that can be a very deadly power that others have over a person.
And it popped up
a number of times.
Book. The one that comes to mind and right away is his falling out with Washington. There was no need for that. Washington even came back and said, well, let's make up.
He apologized, and Hamilton wouldn't.
He wouldn't, and what was the profit in that except to this sort of self-honor?
But let's try to contextualize it just a little, just a tiny bit. So two things. You may agree, you may disagree. Number one, honor, family, pedigree, class mattered almost infinitely more then than they matter now. So then these are very serious issues. They're not, we shrug at a lot of this. Not then. Class hierarchy, birth, enormously important. And Hamilton came from nothing, and others knew this. John Adams said he's the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler.
And that really affected Hamilton's judgment and his behavior is entirely
because he was
understandable.
Defensive about this and insecure and prickly, as he should have been.
At a young age, he saw how bad things could be.
And he knew that his enemies could always say, he's not really one of us. And this is what Jefferson said to Washington in a letter. I don't think Hamilton ever read it. But Jefferson got into this whole struggle with Hamilton for respect and affection and support of George Washington, and it really got way out of hand, and it really hurt George Washington because his view was the two most gifted men in America are in my cabinet. Come on, guys, can't you find a way to work together? Well, they couldn't, but Jefferson said to Washington that he said, I will not have my retirement clouded by a man who from the moment history can be said to have stooped to recognize him represented a tissue of machinations against a country which not only gave him bread and board, but heaped its honors on his head. I repeat, I will not allow my retirement to be damaged by a man from the moment history can be said to have stooped to recognize him.
Wow.
That's Jefferson.
It's probably good that Hamilton didn't read that, or we may be talking about a Hamilton-Jefferson duel.
Jefferson would have ducked it, but Jefferson is basically saying, he's not really one of us.
Yeah,
he's an upstart,
which is kind of creepy. Jefferson.
It is creepy, but that's the error. So that's insight number one. Insight number two is that Hamilton was embarrassed by his father and his mother, of course, shamed, and he knew that at any time, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, anyone who ever wanted to demean him could just say, he may have talent, but look at the circumstances of his
you're
birth.
saying that Hamilton saw this coming. He anticipated
He
it.
had to flare up because he was so defensive about it. protective of his mother, protective of his father, and insecure. Like,
that makes sense.
I'm not really one of them. He knew I'm not really one of them. And one of the last things he said was, before his duel, he said, "This American scene is not for me." He said, "Nobody has done more to prop up the frail and worthless fabric of the Constitution than I have." He said, "It's a shilly-shally thing, a thing of milk and water." And his view was, he said, "This American scene is not really for me." He felt in his deeper recesses as an outsider, and he was made to feel an outsider by those who wished to do him evil. And Jefferson, I have to say, was pretty creepy in using that class card when he was the big, Jefferson's the big advocate of the natural aristocrat.
What you're saying is Jefferson proved Hamilton's suspicions and fears correct.
That is correct. And I don't know if any of our listeners can relate to this, but I can in certain ways. You walk into a room of powerful people, and you feel like you're not really one of them. And whatever your merit is, you just feel like I'm not really one of them. It could be wealth. It could be.
This American scene is not for me.
I think every one of us feels that at times. Every one of us. But Hamilton actually had something to apologize for. He did not come from a distinguished Maryland family. And so what happens is he gets to New York, and the first thing he does is attach himself to the Schuyler family. Philip Schuyler was one of the most powerful and wealthy men of New York. Hamilton marries his daughter, Eliza. Now he's married into prominence. He also attaches himself to the greatest American, George Washington. Now he's the aide-de-camp to a person of enormous social position. And then when the war is over, and Hamilton could easily have gone back to New York, Washington says, "No, I want you to be my financier. I want you to be the Secretary of the Treasury." Hamilton becomes maybe the greatest Secretary of the Treasury in American history.
Oh, and that's such an interesting story, because when somebody is recommending Hamilton to Washington, Washington says, I didn't know he knew finance. Do you remember this?
Yes.
Yeah.
But he knows everything.
Yeah, that was the response.
He's what we would call a policy wonk. And there's that famous story where the Jeffersonians, the emerging Republican anti-Federalist faction, decides to bring Hamilton down. And boy, it has some echoes of stuff that's going on in our world. But leaving that aside, these Jeffersonians decide to bring Hamilton down by entering into a congressional investigation into his actions as the Secretary of the Treasury. And in order to humiliate him, they pass these resolutions of inquiry demanding that he provide these reports on foreign investments and what different pots of money goes where and how he's handled the accounting and so on. They put together these resolutions and they pass them within days of the adjournment of Congress, with the idea that then this scandalous material gets to percolate around for 7 or 8 months before Congress comes back into session. So they think that they're doubly damaging him, first by raising these questions, but second of all, by raising them at the last minute of the congressional session so that he has no real chance to reply. And then all this dark stuff will just sit out there. Well, guess what he did? He went into hyperdrive and he produced like 25,000-word response almost overnight. And then Congress actually said, David, he's clean. There is no evidence of any sort that there is impropriety going on either personally or publicly in Hamilton's administration of the Treasury. So he went into kind of an almost obsessive compulsive mode, but he talked them down, and he proved to all of his detractors that he was not going to give them an advantage. That if sheer hard work and perseverance and focus could be the answer, he'd provide it. And then a little later, he asked for a second investigation because he wanted to make sure that there could never, ever, ever be an allegation that he had been inappropriate professionally as America's first Secretary of the Treasury.
There was a point in his life later on where he was he self-confessed some impropriety, but we'll get to that. Right?
Well, and that comes right out of this. So when you're ready,
go ahead. Sure.
Well, what I've just been saying is that when the investigations came, they were done for the wrong reasons by partisan people. They were done in an unfair way structurally at the last second in this session. Hamilton was able to respond, but then talk about self-destructive. He has a good marriage to Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, growing number of children.
Who was a brilliant woman.
She's a great woman.
Talk a whole show about her.
Loyal, smart, enterprising, resourceful.
And had some of Hamilton's traits, held on to, never forgot.
Some grudges, yes.
Yeah.
So she goes to Albany to be with her parents for the summer with the children. And no sooner is she gone than Hamilton gets drawn into a really tawdry sex blackmail scandal.
Which he eventually confessed in public.
And here's why he confessed. Because the allegations that were being made against him were that he had been engaged in public corruption, insider trading tips and helping his lieutenants make money and even maybe secreting money into foreign bank accounts and so on. So he's accused, with some appearance of evidence, of having been publicly corrupt. And he realizes that the evidence makes it look that way, but the only way he can exonerate himself publicly is to confess to the private corruption, so that these strange meetings and money changing hands and all this, that's not about the public treasury at all. It's about a sex blackmail scandal. And so then Hamilton, who's been involved with this woman named Maria Reynolds, who is clearly being used by her husband to set Hamilton up for blackmail. It's a weird and amazing story. In order to protect his public reputation, Hamilton writes this pamphlet saying, it's all true about the sex stuff. I was drawn into this scandal. I gave the guy about $11,000, which would be a fortune today. It was adultery. I shouldn't have done it. It was a terrible mistake. Here are all the details. He goes into an enormous amount of unnecessary detail. It makes it one of the great sex scandals of American history. But I'll tell you my favorite line from all of it. Maria Reynolds comes to him and asks if she's from New York and her husband is a brute and he's left her and she needs to get back to New York. They're in Philadelphia. And she knows Hamilton is a New Yorker and that he has a sympathy for downtrodden people. Would he maybe be able to provide her some funds to get back to New York? And Hamilton says, I have no ready money, but if you tell me your address, I will bring you some funds. So they're red flag number one, if you tell me your address. So she does, and then he goes there that night with some funds to give to her, and he does. And in his famous confession, he says, he's in her bedroom now. He says, it soon became clear that other than pecuniary consolation would be acceptable. It soon became clear that other than pecuniary consolation would be acceptable. In other words, it soon became clear that she would sleep with me or wanted to sleep with me. And so they become lovers. And then a few weeks later, the brute husband turns back up and announces that his honor has been besmirched, that she no longer loves him, that she won't sleep with him anymore, that all she can talk about is Hamilton, and that he needs satisfaction. So imagine if you're Hamilton. He's at the top of his game. He's the second most important person in the United States.
I don't recall, but I bet this pamphlet was well read.
Everybody read it. I mean,
it would be in our time.
I wish that Hamilton had met Bill Clinton, because you know what Clinton would have said? Admit nothing, ever.
There's so much to talk about with Hamilton, and we have limited time, but there are a few things that I will feel remiss if we don't touch on. One is obviously the Federalist Papers, and we could spend forever talking about that.
And every American should now reread the Federalist Papers in the wake of where we are.
He called it like the best thing.
The best practical guide to government in history, said Jefferson.
And also, I'd like to get your thoughts on this day in June in 1787 where he did this 6-hour speech.
5.5, don't exaggerate.
I'm sorry. I thought it was 6 in the book.
It was a 5.5-hour address to the Constitutional Convention.
And then I would like to ask you about Madison between Jefferson
Poor
and
Madison,
Hamilton.
Caught between these
giants.
I
I kind of look at him as a key of understanding, because he was Hamilton's guy.
They were,
and they fell apart.
Very close friends until Jefferson came back.
And then he became Jefferson's. Yeah. So I'm not certain how to read all of that.
It's all fascinating. It's all one of the. I mean, Hamilton, as you said, is a figure of drama. And everything that happens in his life turns out to be kind of wonderfully strange and fascinating. He's so compelling as a founding father, and people think of him, banks and the national debt and so on. That's not looking at the greatness of this man.
This is so enjoyable to talk to you about this book. I thank you, sir. Right now we're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson. This is our out-of-character special edition of the Jefferson Hour, the book club, number 6 on our list, Ron Chernow's magisterial biography of Alexander Hamilton. Before we took the break, David, you were talking about the way in which Hamilton galvanized or polarized the world around him. And one of the key instances of that is the life of James Madison.
As we know, Madison, Hamilton, great friends, colleagues, but then they fell apart.
Jefferson is out of the country. He's 1784 to 1789 in France. And although he's corresponding with everybody, especially Madison, he's basically off the map. Articles of Confederation are falling apart. The country's really not doing well. And so Madison and Hamilton and a few others decide there has to be a new constitutional convention, and they finally get it done in the summer of 1787. Jefferson is out of the country. Adams is out of the country. George Washington presides at the Constitutional Convention, but the most important figure at the convention is Madison, probably more important than any other single individual. But in the aftermath, during the ratification process, it's going to be a tough go. Most Americans are not really comfortable with the new Constitution, and so the Federalist Papers are begun as a series of columns in newspapers, and the collaboration is between Madison and Hamilton with a little help from John Jay. Hamilton wrote the bulk of the Federalist Papers, and even though he didn't agree with everything that he was writing, it was absolutely brilliant and lucid. It was a powerful pamphlet of persuasion to ratify the Constitution.
But the amount of writing this man did, Hamilton, is unbelievable.
He's an amazing. There's nothing like it. He's like the Isaac Asimov of the Founding Fathers. And so then, Madison and Hamilton are quite close during this period, very close. When we look at this first from Hamilton's point of view, and then from Madison's point of view, and then from Jefferson's point of view. Hamilton's view is everything was going great with Madison. We were almost like bosom buddies and close friends, and we agreed on almost everything. And then that redheaded philosopher, visionary, came home.
Hamilton went against a lot of the views of Jefferson, and I suspect Hamilton, his pamphlet arguing against the physiocrats,
right?
He didn't. Agriculture could not sustain us.
From Hamilton's point of view, Jefferson is just a ninny, because we're not going to be an agrarian country, and if we were, we wouldn't be a worthy country. We can't be a country of strict construction. You need a flexible constitution.
Hamilton wanted banks, and he wanted credit ratings
around the world. We're going to be a manufacturing country, and we're going to have a mixed economy, and we're going to have a foreign policy, and we're going to have central banking, and we're going to have a strong constitution and central authority, and we're going to have a huge, powerful, rich nation. And this cannot be done by your little Jeffersonian farm. So he doesn't hate Jefferson yet. But when Jefferson comes back, from Hamilton's point of view, Jefferson seduces Madison and takes him away from him. Now Madison's point of view. Madison's point of view is Jefferson's gone. He's a bit of a loose cannon, and a lot of philosophical trial balloons go up with Jefferson. But I love him, and I cherish him, and he needs me.
And he's a Virginian.
He's a fellow Virginian, and we're both planters and slaveholders, and we live near each other, and we agree on many, many things. But Madison knew that Jefferson would not have liked the strength of the new Constitution. He knew that he and Jefferson had some really significantly different ways of seeing things, but he thought that his leaving Hamilton was not about Jefferson. Madison thought Hamilton took it too far. He took it too far on repaying the national debt, the assumption bill of the state debts. He's engaged in some insider trading with his pals. He really thinks the country belongs to the moneyed class. He's a crypto aristocrat and maybe a crypto monarchist. And so now Madison is thinking, I like Hamilton up to a point, but Hamilton goes too far. He's for too high-minded, too rich, too centralized, too militaristic a society. And so he's beginning to edge away from Hamilton, and then Jefferson comes back, and of course Jefferson's all poetry and music and dreams. And so Hamilton blames Jefferson. Madison wouldn't say that it was Jefferson. Madison would say Hamilton is the one who broke the relationship. But here's what's so interesting about it, the way that Chernow tells the story. Hamilton's feelings were really hurt. I mean, he was like wounded. It's like a divorce. It's like you lost your best friend.
In a strange way, he was a very sensitive guy.
He was, and he was like hurt, like, what happened to Madison? We were like thick and in harmony and working together, and suddenly Jefferson comes back, and Madison is emerging as my enemy. And Hamilton thought that Madison was actually making bad public policy decisions and betraying Madison's view of the Constitution just to be anti-Hamilton and pro-Jefferson.
There's so much in this book that we can't touch on everything.
But finally, just one sentence on Jefferson. Jefferson's view is, thank goodness I got back in time to save Madison from this guy.
There's so much in this book. We can't touch on everything.
Of course.
But I do think it's important that we spend a bit of time on a really written section in the book, and that is the duel which ended Hamilton's life.
So I'll say a few sentences, you say a few sentences.
Okay.
Hamilton did not want this duel. He may have had a secret death wish because of what happened to his son on the same dueling grounds and his own shame and his own belief that his career was sort of emptying out. But he worked hard not to have a duel with Burr. You know, this is one of the most contested moments in American history. Some people say that Hamilton had hair triggers and he was intending to kill, there's a lot of subterfuge here. Some people believe that he had a death wish. Others believe that he was self-destructive.
I will say, if you're curious about it, you should read this. If one is curious about this, they should read this section because it's really well written.
It's as well done as that story can ever be done.
The details about how he couldn't move and they carried him down laid him in the boat so that he would be refreshed by the breezes and he came back to consciousness.
And they take him home and his wife.
Be careful with that pistol because it's still loaded. And
gets home and he dies 30 hours later.
And that whole tragedy.
And then his daughter goes insane, partly over this, and his wife is really left destitute.
And if we could end with how the book ends, and that's...
she lives on.
She lives on, and as an old widow, she is visited by James Monroe,
who was part of the Maria Reynolds scandal story way back.
Offended her to no end.
And he asks sort of for forgiveness.
Yeah, and boy, does she give it to him.
She hits him right between the eyes. Says, "If you mean," do you have the quote?
I do.
If you mean.
If you have come to tell me that you repent, that you are sorry, very sorry, for the misrepresentations and the slanders and the stories you circulated against my dear husband, if you have come to say this, I understand it. But otherwise, no lapse of time, no nearness to the grave makes any difference. And Monroe just kind of walked out.
Well, Monroe and Hamilton almost got into a duel back in that era, and they got very, very close. Monroe was not guilty of what Elizabeth Hamilton accused him of. Jefferson was her enemy, not James Monroe, but I love what she said. If you really mean it, then maybe. But if you're going to defend yourself,
I have no more time for you.
Yeah, it's a great story.
It's time for your essay, sir. But we can agree to both give a thumbs up to reading this book.
This is an indispensable book, not only for anyone who wants to understand Alexander Hamilton and give him a fair chance, but an indispensable book for understanding the era and also Thomas Jefferson.
Thank you, sir. And it is now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Just a little rant about the way we still see history. I'm reading an essay by a serious Lewis and Clark scholar. He's writing about the gathering of the crew of the expedition. For a long time, Lewis and Clark types have spoken of a group of men recruited in Pittsburgh and on the Ohio River, including the Falls of the Ohio at Louisville, as the 9 young men from Kentucky. They are George Shannon, George Gibson, Charles Floyd, Joseph Field, his brother Reuben Field, John Coulter, William Bratton, and Nathaniel Pryor. Fair enough. But William Clark also recruited his African-American body slave York, no last name, for the expedition. Isn't York the 10th young man from Kentucky? If we continue to use the phrase 9 young men from Kentucky, by which we mean 9 young white free men from the Ohio River Valley, and exclude York because he was black, because he was a slave, because he was not an official member of the expedition, we are perpetuating a racist way of seeing our history. York turned out to be a valuable member of the Corps of Discovery. In fact, if you were making a list of the contributions of the 10 young men from Kentucky, he would rank behind Coulter and the Field brothers, but ahead of Bratton, Gibson, Floyd, Shannon, and probably Pryor. If you give special weight to those who kept journals, Floyd might rank higher, and Shannon later was dispatched to help the writer Nicholas Biddle put the journals into publishing form. But you take my point. The phrase 9 young men from Kentucky is convenient and it has a poetic ring, but it should now be retired in the name of simple justice, including racial justice. Then there is Sacagawea, the first or second most famous Indian woman in American history. What we know about her for certain could be contained in a passport book. She is what Winston Churchill said of the Soviet Union, a riddle wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma. No two people can agree on what her contribution was to the Lewis and Clark expedition. Each generation has tended to project onto her its fantasy about an Indian princess traveling with 32 men across America. We have finally nearly overcome the idea that she guided Lewis and Clark, and we have begun to challenge the notion that she was a disarming frontier diplomat in a lovely female package. We have edged away from the 19th century idea that she was a representative of domesticity and family. She was with her rascal husband Charbonneau and their infant son Jean-Baptiste, awash in a sea of testosterone. Some writers cling to the notion that her knowledge of prairie turnips and wild strawberries enabled the crew to supplement its all-meat diet, but that could not have amounted to much in so large a company. We know that she was resourceful in at least one crisis, when her bumbling husband nearly sank the command module of the voyage, the White Pirogue, just inside Montana in May 1805. What Sacagawea really did gets little press. When the moment came, she helped translate from English-French Hidatsa to Shoshone, her birth language, so that the expedition could get the horses they would need to cross the Rocky Mountains. That was why they brought her along from Fort Mandan in today's North Dakota. She performed admirably. It is quite possible that President Jefferson never knew of her existence, never knew her name even, at least until he read the Biddle paraphrase of the expedition narrative in 1814, a full 6 years after the return. Here's why this is important. Lewis and Clark did receive a great deal of Indian help: food, firewood, maps drawn in the dirt, canoes and the help making canoes, horses purchased at below-market prices, very important diplomatic work by Native American emissaries, linguistic services, and some actual guiding by Nez Perce young men on the return journey. Almost all of this was by people not named Sacagawea, and yet they have been ignored in books written about Lewis and Clark. The two scholars who have challenged this view are James Rhonda, who wrote Lewis and Clark Among the Indians in 1984, and in that book relegated Sacagawea to an appendix, and my friend David Nicandri, who carefully laid out the real and essential help Lewis and Clark got from Native Americans on the Pacific side of the Rocky Mountains in his book River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia. Nicandri names names and cites dozens of instances when men like Ted O'Harsky and Twisted Hair and Cut Nose smoothed the path for the noisy, bearded, smelly, aggressive, linguistically challenged, and often frightening American explorers. Exalting Sacagawea is in some respects an erotic fantasy that bears resemblance to the scores of captivity narratives that traveled out of the West to printing presses back east. She is a central figure in the story because she enlivens it, gives it romance and color, embodies a white person's fantasy of the fetching Indian princess, like Pocahontas, who casts her lot with the invaders. James Rhonda was right to ensconce her in an appendix, and Nicandry did pioneering work for Lewis and Clark studies by giving scholarly attention to the individuals who actually made the difference in the expedition's transcontinental journey. Finally, we need to stop looking upon American Indians as bit players and support staff in the success of the Lewis and Clark expedition. They met more than 50 native groups, tribes, nations, bands, clans. Although Lewis liked to think of himself as the first civilized man to see X and Y and Z, we know that Native Americans had discovered everything in the West hundreds and even thousands of years before Jefferson was born in Western Virginia. We know of at least 15 maps fashioned for the captains by native geographers, some on animal skins, some drawn in the mud, some actually on paper. If you wore the lens of actual, evidence-based Native American help, advice, and guiding services, you would see that it is a mutual encounter and mutual discovery story from the very beginning, and it goes far beyond the narrative of the expedition rolling up, erecting a flag, distributing some gifts and sovereignty tokens, giving a pompous speech about the Great Father, and then pressing on towards the Great Stinking Lake, as they called it, the Pacific. For 100 years, York was seen in the Lewis and Clark literature as a sexual athlete and a kind of minstrel figure, a human exhibit called Big Medicine, who frostbit his penis on the plains of North Dakota, and for whom the tawny damsels, as Lewis called them, lifted their buckskins. During that same time, Sacagawea was seen as a princess, a guide, an early suffragette, a curvy diplomat, and a white man's fantasy of an Indian bride. Samuel Johnson, of the Dictionary of the English Language in 1755, used to say to his callow young friend James Boswell, "Clear your mind of cant." Cant is sloppy, unrigorous, sentimental, self-soothing thinking. Dr. Johnson was right. We must clear our minds of cant. The best thing that could happen is that device from the Men in Black movies would zap the whole world of Lewis and Clark lovers, so that they had to approach the journals with entirely fresh eyes. We now spend so much time trying to correct for prior biases and misconceptions, received traditions, persistent early cliches and agreeable tropes, for example, that Lewis and Clark were the best friends in American history, that we cannot see the expedition for what it actually was. In all things, our duty is intellectual independence, a close scrutiny of language, evidence, nuance, and what is not recorded in the journals, official documents of the government, as well as what found its way to paper. The Enlightenment philosophe and encyclopediast Denis Diderot wrote, "All things must be examined, debated, investigated, without exception and without regard for anyone's feelings." And above all, we all must strive to clear our minds of cant. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.